Welcome to another edition of Inside the Game. I'm Pierre McGuire. In the first edition, we had the great Mike Eruzione. In the second edition, we had the Deputy Commissioner of the National Hockey League, Bill Daly. The third, the legendary Mike Emmerich. But nobody better than the winningest coach of all time, the great Scotty Bowman. Scotty, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Pierre. Good to be on.
It's great to have you with us. What'd you think of the Olympics?
Oh boy, I mean, so much. It's so competitive, but it's so different than the NHL, as you know, with the games that they play. But I mean, it was exciting for everybody for sure. I mean, when you get in overtime is overtime, and even though even the people during the regular season is different than the playoffs, but it's still exciting. It's so exciting.
The closest you probably ever came to coaching in something like that would have been the 76 Canada Cup. How good was that Canada Cup team that you coached?
Oh, that was an awesome team. It was only we had a reunion last September, and there was only two of the entire roster that aren't in the Hall of Fame. I mean, I one time I knew five of the defensemen were in because Robinson, Savard, Lapointe from Canadiens, and then Dennis Potvin with the Islanders and Bobby Orr that was sort of his last hurrah, and he got the MVP. I mean, it was really close with both he and Dennis. They had great tournaments, but Bobby was amazing. But yeah, five defensemen, and the sixth one wasn't too bad either. Jim Watson from Philadelphia. He was a mainstay of their two Stanley Cups. So yeah, it was a great team, and we got stymied, Pierre. Like we talked about Connor Hellebuck the other night. They had a guy named Latimer Zarilla. He was 40. I think he was 40 or 41 for the Czech Republic at the time, and that they had both Czechs and Slovaks, but that until not the 90s. But he was unbelievable. I mean, I don't know. I know it was in the range of 50 something or 50 to 60 shots, and he beat us 1-0 in one. I think we had the playoff game, and then I'm not sure if it was a 2 out of 3, but that was the famous series that we got into overtime in one of the other games. Daryl Sittler, that was he. I just saw some notes the other day that he said that goal that he scored in the Olympics, because it was in 76, and Daryl would have been drafted in 71, I think. He was the year after Perot and those guys, but he said that propelled his career. And then I think in 76 is when he had his big 10-point. Remember he had the still a record, isn't it? Six goals, 4 assists.
Yeah.
But Daryl played on a line with Lanny McDonald because he was playing with him in Toronto for a lot of his career, and Marcel Dion was the center. And I think that was like the third or fourth line. It was hard to believe. I mean,
Well,
the team.
the goalie that played against Daryl Sittler that night was Dave Moon Reese, who ended up being a very legendary prep school coach at the Berkshire School and also at Trinity Pauling.
And they
So
never
one of the great things about you is you're never afraid to say who taught you how to do what you've done so well for so long. Can you tell the people at home some of your mentors and some of the people who
Wow.
really helped you along the way?
Well, obviously a lot of veteran players, but on the off the rink, Toe Blake, obviously, because I was in Montreal growing up as a young coach, junior for about 4 years there, and I also before I went back to Montreal and before I got to know Toe, Toronto, Punch Imlach. The Maple Leafs trained every fall in Peterborough, and I was in Peterborough 3 years, 58 to 61, and Punch came in, I think, around 57 or 58. He was just rebuilding, and he built it with some veteran players, and and the training camps were 6 weeks in those days. And even though I was coaching a Montreal Canadian farm team I mean, we had players that were on the sponsored list. I mean, some of them played in the NHL. Jim Roberts, Wayne Connolly, Barclay Plager, and but he didn't have any prejudice because I was working for Canadians, and I met him through a veteran player that I'd met somehow in Montreal. Bert Olmsted played for the Canadians when they were winning those cups, and then he went to Toronto, and he was at the training camp with the Maple Leafs. Punch got him because all of his he rebuilt the Leafs with a lot of veterans, Alan Stanley and these kind of players, but he had young players too. He had Dave Keon, Frank Mahovlich, Dick Duff, and those veterans meant a lot. He mixed up a lot of the Alan Stanley. I had Tim Horton and Johnny Bauer in the goal, and Carl Brewer was another young defenseman that came up the ranks. So I spent a lot of time with Punch. He took me golfing a couple of times. I had lunch with he and Frank King Clancy, and it was just seeing. I mean, I didn't have to ask him any questions. I just saw how he operated, and he was a bit of a tyrant. Some people will say that that played for him, but the veterans won't say it because he gave them a second lease on life, and the same as Toe Blake. I mean, Toe would have rubbed players. That there was a lot of players that he couldn't put them in stellar roles because the team was so good. And one was a boyhood friend of mine that I played midget hockey with. He was a year and a half older than me, but we played on the same provincial midget championship. Don Marshall, and Don Marshall was a great Canadian junior hockey player, captain of a Memorial Cup team, one of the best 2 or 3 juniors in Canada, Pierre. And he came out of junior hockey, and he had to go and play 2 years in lower leagues. Canadians were so strong. He was a centerman. Canadians had Jean Beliveau was 27, and Henri Richard was like 24. They had Phil Goyette. They then later got Backstrom, but they had 6 centers. They looked like the Olympic teams that Canada and USA had. And that always shows you when you can get a good player, you don't worry about position if he's a center.
One of the great stories you told me about Toe Blake was when you were winning or on your way to winning the cup in '73 in Montreal. Toe had heard Ken Dryden give an interview to Montreal media, and he was kind of criticizing the big three on the defense at the time. And Toe grabbed you and whispered in your ear. Do you want to share what he has said to you and his counsel to you?
Well, Toe was a wonderful man to have. Like, he retired his last championship. I was at the other bench with the Blues in '69. He retired, and then 2 years later, I went to Montreal. So I mean, I didn't know. I knew of him, but I'd spent a lot of time when I coached the juniors in early '60s. I used to see him every Friday, and try to ask him a lot of questions. And I watched their team practice a lot. And when I took over the Canadiens in '71, and then later on for the next 8 years, Toe always came in the locker room at the home games. He traveled in the playoffs with us, which was always a big bonus for everybody, but because he had won so many times. And he came in the dressing room, and he would always look around some player that maybe didn't play a lot, a young player or something, or somebody that had a tough game, and he would go and offer encouragement. He never ever tried to interfere with my coaching, but he would go, and we had a lot of young players that Steve Shutt, Bob Gainey, but he would go to them and say, "Hey, don't worry about it. Your time is coming. You got it." And that means a lot to a young player who's frustrated. He's got his friends telling him he should probably be playing more and all that. So we lost a tough game in game we won the series in 6 games. So it would be game 5. We were tied with the Hawks, Chicago, 2 games each, coming home. A big CBS had the rights at that time, and they were doing the game on a Sunday afternoon. I mean, we're playing at home. We're favored to win. Ken Dryden was superb goalie. The other end was a great goalie, Tony Esposito. His rookie year, he got 13 shutouts. And it's hard to believe when I think back. The game was 8-7. We got beat 8-7. I mean, pretty pretty big setback, because now we're we're not clinching the Stanley. We're now it's three games to two, and now we got to get on the train or the plane the next day and go into Chicago. And anyways, Toll came to the dressing room. He wanted to just lift up the spirits of Ken Dryden, but Ken was really frustrated in that game, and there was an awful lot of outnumbered chances, 3-on-2s and two, because we got behind in the game. And when you're behind and you have a team like we had, you just open up the floodgates and you start trying to score goals. And of course, when you try that kind of hockey, sometimes you get burned. And every time we got within a goal, boom, Chicago would score another one. So we lost 8-7. And Ken I don't think he was really, he just said, he was so frustrated. The media was asking him a lot of questions, and he always had a lot of patience for the media, really, after the game. And he just said, look, nothing I could do. I mean, you get a lot of 3-on-2s, you get 2-on-1s. What can I do? And so Toe was really trying to get to him, but he finally had to leave, because the thing went on for about 15 minutes. And then we were staying up in the Laurentian Mountains before we took the plane the next day. We were, when we used to play in the playoffs, we didn't spend a lot of time at home. We'd go on the road, and we'd also come back and stay up north, maybe get the odd afternoon at home. So he called me at night, and he said, I just wanted to give you a heads up, Scotty, that what I heard him say, unfortunately, in the newspaper this morning, it was magnified. And I'm not saying that he went away on the line, but the press really took upon themselves. And it had stuff that Dryden threw the defense under the bus and everything. But he said, my tip to you is, I know we didn't have a goalie coach. And I didn't do much talking with Ken. Ken was always a loner. I didn't have to ever tell him how to play, and we talked. He wanted to play all the time too. So we never had much discussion. And Toe said, you got to talk to him. I said, well, it's going to be tough. He said, well, I think you got to say to him that he's got some fences to mend with those defensemen, especially the big three. So we skated the next day, I think, in Chicago. We had a day off between games, but we always put a little bit of effort into the between games. And I finally had the courage to go up to him, and it was not easy. And I was 5'8" and he's 6'4". And in fact, when he wrote the book later, he put the picture on the back of the book of me talking to him at the practice. And I said, Ken, I have to talk to you. I said, and I just told him that Toe Blake called me and said, I better speak to you. And I said, I am. And I said, unfortunately, the media blew up the story. And I said, is there any way that you could, I mean, I know you could, these guys pretty well, but I think you should make an effort to take the defense maybe for lunch or something. And he said, well, I mean, it was all factual. And he at the beginning, he was kind of a little perturbed maybe that I told him, but then he come around and he said, okay, I'll take it. And he did take them out in Chicago. And we won this. Well, we had another long game in Chicago. We won 6-4. So 10 goals. Imagine 15 in one game and 10 in the other. And the two best goalies, Pierre, he and Tony, were the two top goalies of the 70s. And it's just amazing.
You know what else is amazing? A lot of old hockey people say your team in 76 beating the Philadelphia Flyers helped change the way teams develop their players. That was the Broad Street Bullies, and your team went in there in 76 and obviously won. Scotty, what did you have to say to your team to go into such a hostile environment? You guys didn't play that way. I know you had artillery, you had a lot of big guys, especially Larry Robinson. How did you pursue that series? Because I think it's one of the better coaching jobs you may have ever done.
Well, my assistant Claude Ruel and I, we knew going in how tough it was to play Philadelphia. We had a pretty good record going into that season against them. We had a big brawl in Philadelphia in a training camp game, so we had enough players that could stand up. But that wasn't our whole concept about that team was Bobby Clarke, Reg Leach, and Bill Barber. That line, Pierre, And I coached against a lot of lines in my 28 years coaching. And I'm telling you, for a two-way line of production and also defensive ability, and Reggie Leach wasn't a defensive player, but Clarke was a just premium player. And Bill Barber was a really good scorer, and he paid attention to defensive hockey. Well, no, we didn't have a line that could match up really. And I don't think any team in the league had a line that could match up with them. So what we tried to do, we had three good lines, and we talked about it. And I said we can't let Clarke's line take over the series. So the only way to do it, we're going to give them a sprinkling throughout the series of each of the three lines. And what we did, we had a checking line of Doug Jarvis, Bob Gainey, and Jim Roberts. They were really good defensively, but if you played a checking line too much against that line, your top players aren't getting on. So we had Jacques Lemaire, Guy Lafleur, and Steve Shutt. Now, Jacques was a tremendous defensive player. Once he played center with those two, we could have played them against Clarke, Barber, Leach, but we wouldn't have had an edge. So that was another line. Then we had a really different type of line. We had Doug Risebrough and Mario Tremblay. They were like little tigers. They could pound for pound, they could take on anybody of their reasonable size. They weren't heavyweights, but they were the best middleweights, and they could fight if somebody took advantage of themselves or other players, and Yvan Lambert. So what we did in that series, I had to instruct the players, but I would start Lemaire's line, and I told them 15 seconds, get off, 20 seconds. And then next time at home, you got the change, so that was no problem. But we played the last two games in Philadelphia to win the cup. And I said in Philadelphia, like if we started Riseborough's line, because Bobby Clarke was a tough player. I mean, he wasn't a fighter, but whoever played against them knew that they were in for a tough night. And so I gave them and Pierre, that just using that whole thing for 4 games in a row, I feel we caught Bobby Clarke's line off speed. They couldn't dominate, although Reggie Leach scored 19 goals. I think Reggie Leach won the Conn Smythe that year. He scored 19 goals. He could shoot the puck where Cam Neely could shoot on Patrick Roy. Right-hand shot, picking that stick side. He was a great goal scorer. But anyways, that's pretty well what we did because we just felt we weren't gonna match up.
You've had this amazing ability over your 5 decades of coaching of adapting to each and every decade. But then I look at what you did in 1997 with your Detroit Red Wing team. You're playing again Philadelphia, and you're all of a sudden faced the Legion of Doom, and everybody thought it was going to be Konstantinov getting the big matchup physically against the Legion of Doom line led by Eric Lindros. But you said, no, you know what? I'm going to do something different. I'm going to play Lidstrom and Murphy, 2 really good puck movers against him. Can you take us by your thought process there, Scotty? Because it shows you evolved over the years.
Vladimir Konstantinov, Pierre, was one of the most aggressive and toughest defensemen for body checking that I ever had him on all my rosters. But I didn't want to he wasn't as, Lindros was a force. I mean, he was a big, strong guy. I mean, he could bowl over pretty well any player in the league. And I didn't want to sort of poke the bear, because I knew Konstantinov would not back off, and he would be trying to. And I think sometimes when you're playing against those kind of players, Pierre, if you poke that bear and you get him interested in playing, you're going to pay a price. So Murphy could really handle the puck. Lidstrom, he played against a lot of guys that tried to run him, but he was so smart. I mean, he never got into any fracases with these guys because he could move out of the way. And I just felt, rather than have Konstantinov going head to head against Lindros, and we wanted, like the story was, we wanted that line to sleep a little bit. you know, and we weren't going to go to sleep with Konstantinov. Maybe Larry Murphy and they might have looked at them and said, "Well, we don't have to bang these guys around," because I mean, I think that Nick, I not think I know Nick and Larry, they nullified the line just through finesse. And sometimes in the playoffs you can get away with that, but sometimes you got to be careful. So that was the reason, only because Konstantinov was a force. He enjoyed Pierre. He's one of those defensemen that liked to catch everybody with his head down, and he did. And sometimes, you know, you meet your match, but you weren't going to meet the match with him. And I didn't want the matchup. Lindros was, I mean, that whoever said Legion of Doom was a pretty good line, because Renberg wasn't physical, and neither was Leclerc, but they were big guys. But I think until Lindros got into those concussion injuries, I mean, Pierre, you remember, I'm sure you'll remember this game because we were both there. Mario, when Lindros made his rookie season debut, we played, I think it was in Pittsburgh. And here's Lindros coming out of junior with all that fanfare. Boy, he sure opened our eyes. He was, I mean, for his age, I'm not sure, would he be 20 or 19? I don't think he was 8.
And they would have been 19.
And he went in there, and I mean, Mario was a class by himself, but Lindros put a pretty good show on that day. And they said, boy, we looked at this guy. I mean, well, I mean, obviously it was overpriced maybe, but the trade that Quebec got, the type of players they got for him, Pierre, Forsberg and Ricci and all these guys, the Migs.
Ronnie Hextall. Yeah, no, you're right. It's a lot of guys. You know, we talked about your 5 decades and how you evolved over time and those strategy things that you came up with. One of the things that people don't know enough about you, your commitment to your family. I remember when I lived with you, you used to say to me all the time, make sure you call your family every single day, sometime more than once. I remember, Scotty, we would play games on an afternoon, and you would get in the car in Pittsburgh and you would drive home to Buffalo to be with your family. And you would say to me, gonna have Saturday night dinner at home, gonna go to church with them on Sunday, and then I'll meet you guys on the road. You did that your whole career. Nobody knows about that.
Well, it's pretty hard, Pierre. I've heard players talk about it, and I've heard coaches and managers and even scouts, but you're away a lot. And I think when you're family, when you have a family, it's a big thing when you have enough that you have to move the whole family. We didn't want to move. They were just in high school, and we just felt that my wife could take her things at home. I only had a 3.5 hour trip. It was a shock for me to have to go. That's why I went originally to Pittsburgh, because, well, I was doing television. I was getting a little stale, because when you're with a team for a long time, and you must have felt it yourself, and then you get into television or radio, whatever you are, and it's interesting, and I enjoyed it. But when the game is over and you're not rooting for one side or the other, and you've been doing that all your life since the time I went to Ottawa, I was 22 years of age. My first time trying to win games as an assistant coach, but so I with juniors. So I didn't have and then when I got the call from Craig Patrick that I could join the Penguins, they had just hired Bob Johnson. That was a big plus for me, because I mean, he was going to be a career coach. Unfortunately, with his timely passing, it didn't happen. But so that was a pretty good fit, because he said you can work out of home, which I did. I went into Pittsburgh first year about I would say every month or 6 weeks, and spend a couple of games at home, and then go on the road again. And I did a lot of games around Buffalo and Toronto. If we made a few trades, Craig had me go and tag along with the Minnesota team, because we were doing the trade to get Larry Murphy. So I followed that team for 2 weeks. And anytime we wanted to get a player, I went to Peoria, because Craig had a lot of good ideas. He said, Gordy Roberts, and Gordy still sends me a note every now and again. Thank you for rekindling my career. But so what I'm getting at is I went to Pittsburgh because I didn't have to travel. I didn't have to leave my home. And then the next year, when we found the news about Bob in mid-August, and Craig just felt that we wanted to keep nobody knew. You never know when a person like Bob got sick, and they don't say that it's terminal. So we wanted to keep the coaching position. We wanted to keep it open and encourage, because Bob was a battler anyways. And Craig came to me in training camp and said, I don't want to put a young coach in here and just sidetrack Bob. I want to keep the job. I want interim. Would you take it for a couple of months and let's see what's going to happen around Thanksgiving? And of course, everyone knows Bob passed away at Thanksgiving, and by that time the team was. It wasn't really, we were about 500, a little above that. We weren't it's like any team in the Stanley Cup. You win a cup like the Pittsburgh did, a big miracle winning the first year. And then the next year, it takes a while to get going. So Craig said, look, I don't want to change anything. Can you hang on till the end of the year? Well, I mean, I took the job on the premise that I wouldn't have to do it the whole year. And then when I said, sure, I'll finish the season for you, but that's the reason that I didn't move my family, because it wasn't going to be very, very permanent. And that, I think a lot of people do that, Pierre. And I was lucky because I could get back to Pittsburgh. And when they're in high school, I think they were all in high school by then, the four of them, so that they could. My four they could go on their own. They had their own independence. And yes, they miss you miss them, but it's a lot different when they're in their teens,
Mm-hmm. One of the real cool parts of your story is a guy named G Talbot who just passed away. You were an amazing hockey player and a football player. People don't know that about you. He hit you with a stick in a junior game. Your career basically ended there. It led to this amazing coaching career. But when you were in St. Louis and you needed a veteran player, you brought G Talbot in. Could you take us behind the parameter of doing that?
He was in the mix when we were rating all the players. Lynn Patrick was the manager and I was assistant, and he leaned on me quite a bit because I knew all the Montreal players. So we leaned into Montreal. We missed Jean-Guy in the expansion draft. I mean, we were going to take him. I mean, even though that was years ago, we're talking now 15 years had passed since that happened. And he'd won the 5 cups with the Canadiens. He was a proven player, but he was getting on. And Minnesota jumped in and drafted him. And we were ready. We had him on our list to draft, but then we didn't get him. And then all of a sudden, I think it was like around December, we were shocked. But they used to make a lot of impromptu moves, and they put him on waivers. And I was by that time I was coaching full time, the head coach, and Lynn had been moved up to the office. And I said, Lynn, we got to take this guy. I mean, he's got experience. He can not only can he play defense. He proved that in Montreal. But I said, we've already got Jim Roberts, and he can move up and back. And it just fit like a glove, Pierre, because we could dress 10 forwards. And we could dress 6 defensemen. We didn't play 6 defensemen, though. We could dress 16 players. So what we had G Talbot and Jim Roberts could play as a tandem, as a third pair on defense, and they could also move up, and because they could both skate and they knew how to play defensive hockey, and they could both play right and left wing. And we had a centerman, Terry Crisp. It was our 10th forward. Boy, I'm telling you, we won so many games. What we did is we played 3 pairs of defensemen. They played defense the first 2 periods, and because they could move up and back, they'd done that before. All of a sudden, in the 3rd period, we went 4 lines, and our defense was rested enough. We had Bob Plager and Noel Picard, and we had Barclay Plager with Al Arbor. Well, we didn't want to play 60 minutes with 4 defense, but they only had to play in the 3rd period. So we had an ideal team. I mean, that's why our team won. And the goaltending for 2 years, the 2nd and 3rd year, we had Jacques Plante and Glenn Hall. They played in the high 30s each. I mean, that team was so good defensively because of the goaltending. Pierre, it was just an amazing accomplishment the way the players could play, because we had 13 shutouts one year. I know that. And we had 20 games. We gave up 1 goal. 31 games out of the 76, I think it was. If we scored a goal, we got a point. And only because of defensive hockey.
I've only got 5 minutes left with you, but one of the things I don't think people know enough about you, the relationship you had with the man that came before Bobby Orr and who really set the template for Bobby Orr, and that's the great Doug Harvey. And you used to go watch Doug's teams play in Kansas City because that was your farm.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
And then you'd bring them up. And I remember the one story you told me. He said to you, Scotty, I got this guy and this guy, but I also got me. You can call me up too. Do you want to tell that story?
Well, we lost the 6th game at home in the first round, the first year we lost a tough game to Philadelphia, and then we had to go play game 7 there. And Kansas City should have won the 5th game at home, whoever they were playing in the Central playoffs, and they got beat. It was an upset. And I didn't want to tell Doug Harvey. He was playing coach, and I didn't want to say, if you lose tonight, but I said, look, our game is going to be after yours. Can you hang on, and I'll call the office. You'll be in the office after. And I called him, and we got beat in we got beat in overtime. A real lucky goal beat us, knocked us down to have to go to game 7, and they got knocked out. In those days, the rules were, any player on your farm team could not be recalled unless they were eliminated. So you couldn't disturb the lineup. Well, they got eliminated that night, and I called them up. And we were going into Philadelphia, and I had a couple of players I wanted to sort of change. They didn't play very well in places like Philadelphia. And I called them, and we had some good young players there. And I called them, and I said, "Oh, Doug, I need a couple of little change of forwards." And he had Gary Veneruzzo and a guy named Craig Cameron, a right and left winger. And I asked him, I said, "What about those 2 guys? They're having a great year. They were good in the playoffs." And I said, "I'd like to bring them up. I got 2 I want to change." And then he said, "Well, I got a 3rd one." I said, "Well," because I had checked it out with our people. I said, "Who?" He said, "Well, I'm ready myself." And I never thought about it. But Al Arbour got hurt in game 6 in the 3rd period, and he had a pulled groin. And I said, "Gee, maybe we should do that." So I said, "Doug, if you want to come along." He said, "I don't want to come along. I want to play." So he drove his car with the two other players into St. Louis. We went into Philadelphia. We couldn't get rooms at that time. It was around Easter, I think, and we had to go to Hershey. We stayed in Hershey. We went to Philadelphia, game 7. We won 3-1, an empty net, a goal by Red Berenson to win us 3-1. And Doug Harvey played 45 minutes, and Al Arbour played 40. And we shut him right down. And Harvey played the next year. He played regular. We kept him on. He played a full season. The next year, he got into an accident near the end of the year, but he played pretty well. He played all the playoffs the first year, and the second year he played during the season. And even when he was 44 years old, Pierre, we played Detroit, and Gordie Howe he still was 40 years old, and he still could play like he was 25. And Doug could play against Gordie Howe, and his trick was, boy, you don't want to poke the bear with this guy. And Doug had a good stick, and he was 44, and they had respect for each other too. Doug was about 4 years older than him, but I mean, he came in, and I never saw a player do that at 44 years old playing the minutes. But he often, when he played in Montreal, Pierre, they only had 4 defensemen. He pretty well could play. The way he played, they didn't rush the puck. He could rush it when he wanted to in the 3rd period if they needed a rush, but the defensemen didn't rush the puck except Red Kelly. No other defenseman. And Doug could play as much time as you want.
I know we only have a couple minutes left. One of the greatest nights of my life, you called me at the Detroit Marriott Hotel. It was the day before game 6 in Detroit. It's in 2002, your last game. You take me for dinner at the Grosse Pointe Yacht Club. I'll never forget that night. It was just you and I in the private room. And you told me, tomorrow we're going to win, and I'm going to skate with the Stanley Cup. And I've never asked you about it since then, and it's the first time I really wanted to ask you about it. You won the Stanley Cup, and you skated with it. Was it skating with the cup what you thought it would be?
It sure was, because Pierre, it was an Olympic year in that '02, and we went as a team to train in Orlando, and we allowed the players, like same as it did right now, and the players brought their families, and my kids came down. They took a few days off school, and that's when it hit me, and I said, and I had thought about leaving the year before, but we lost, and I said, eventually you're going to leave. I was turning 70, and right there I said to myself, this is it. I'm going to make this my last hurrah. It was in the same time, around mid-February. So I had made up my mind then. I mean, it's easy to say it now, but I had made up my mind that I win, lose, I'm out. I'm out of there. I wanted to leave. And then when I got in the finals, of course, it was even more pressing, because I had made up my mind, and so I knew I wasn't going to get another shot at it, and I was hoping, and I was so fortunate. And once again, I felt like Toe Blake. Toe Blake beat us, the Blues, in '69, and walked away from 8 cups in 13 seasons, and I felt the same way. I could leave the job, knowing that, I was even so funny, Pierre, that when I was offered to go overseas to coach, and when they had some of the lockout games, the Russian players, I went to the Red Square, and I told one of the Igor Larionov or Fetisov, I'm not too anxious to coach, because I won my last game, and I want to keep saying that. So we went. So I went over there. I went over and coached,
I remember.
and we played in overtime. And Paul Coffey was one of the players on our team, and the Russians were beating us 8-7, and Coffey went through the whole team and scored, and we ended up tied, and we didn't play it. That was it. I said, "Oh, I didn't lose my last game." So that's my story, Terry.
You know what? I'll never forget that night in your office in Detroit. It was so much fun. What an amazing career. You're the most amazing friend and mentor. You're an awesome husband and father and grandfather, and you're the best coach that ever lived, Scotty Bowman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be with you, Pierre. I'm sorry we had to cut it off, but I hope we had enough time to explain what we were all about. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
We know what you're all about. It's all about winning. Thank you for watching this edition of Inside the Game. We'll see you next time.